It's always fascinating to me the way people construct their own realities, often so meticulously that they truly believe their version of events, even when it directly clashes with undeniable facts. And when those narratives involve family, particularly siblings, that clash isn't just a disagreement, it's a seismic event that can shatter lives. You see it every day, but sometimes a story lands on your desk and you know right from the first phone call that you're about to walk into a maelstrom of denial, betrayal, and deeply buried resentments. This particular one, the story of Sarah and Emily, came to me with a title that practically screamed for attention. My sister says I'm a delusional liar, but she never tells you what she did. That phrase alone, that little addendum at the end, that's where my ears perked up. Because when someone throws out an accusation like delusional liar and then immediately pivots to, but she never tells you what she did, you know you're not just dealing with a simple conflict. You're dealing with a deeply ingrained pattern of blame, a meticulously crafted defense mechanism, and almost certainly a long history of unspoken truths and unacknowledged wounds. When Sarah first reached out to our show, she presented herself as the wronged party, the victim of her sister Emily's relentless campaign of defamation. She claimed Emily was spreading vicious rumors, sabotaging her relationships, and generally making her life a living hell. She wanted to expose Emily, to finally set the record straight, to show the world that she was the innocent one and Emily was the aggressor, perhaps even mentally unstable. Emily, on the other hand, had a very different story. From her perspective, Sarah was indeed a delusional liar, someone who fabricated events, exaggerated stories, and lived in a fantasy world where she was always the hero and anyone who challenged her was an enemy. Emily's primary goal was to get Sarah to acknowledge her sickness, to get help, to stop the cycle of manipulation and deceit that Emily claimed had plagued their family for decades. Now, as a professional, my job isn't to take sides. My job is to peel back the layers, to get to the truth, and to understand the psychological underpinnings of why people behave the way they do. When you have two people, two sisters who grew up in the same house, sharing the same parents, the same experiences, yet presenting such diametrically opposed versions of reality, the truth isn't going to be a simple, clear-cut picture. It's going to be messy, it's going to be painful, and it's going to require digging deep into the soil of their past, into the very foundations of their relationship, to understand how they arrived at this point of absolute war. My initial impression of Sarah was that she was articulate, even charming, but there was a fragility beneath the surface, a hypervigilance that suggested a deep-seated fear of being exposed. She spoke with a conviction that was almost unsettling, a certainty in her own narrative that brooked no questioning. She saw herself as misunderstood, constantly battling against a world that refused to see her truth. Emily, by contrast, seemed exhausted. Her voice carried the weight of years of frustration and a profound sense of resignation. She wasn't just angry, she was tired of fighting, tired of being dismissed, tired of feeling like she was the only one who saw things clearly while everyone else was being fooled. She came to the show not necessarily to win, but to simply be heard, to have someone, anyone, validate her experience. What became immediately clear was that their entire relationship was built on a foundation of perceived slights, unfulfilled expectations, and a desperate yearning for validation that neither was capable of giving the other. Sarah felt constantly betrayed by Emily's lack of support, viewing Emily's attempts to correct her as malicious attacks. Emily felt continually gaslit by Sarah's refusal to acknowledge reality, viewing Sarah's embellishments as deliberate manipulations. This wasn't just a sibling squabble. It was a deep-seated psychological entanglement, a dance of accusations and counter-accusations that had been perfected over a lifetime. When we started to delve into their shared history, the backstory as we call it, the picture began to clarify, or rather to become more complex. You see, often these family dynamics don't just appear out of nowhere. They're cultivated, nurtured, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes quite deliberately within the family unit itself. It's like a garden where certain weeds have been allowed to grow unchecked, eventually choking out everything else. And in Sarah and Emily's case, those weeds seem to have taken root very, very early. Their parents, while seemingly loving, appeared to have played a significant role in fostering this dynamic. It was never explicitly stated, but the underlying narrative that emerged was one of favoritism, or at least a perceived imbalance in attention and validation. Sarah, the younger sister, often described herself as the creative one, the sensitive one, the one who needed more emotional care. Emily, the elder, often portrayed herself as the responsible one, the practical one, the one who was expected to be resilient and independent. These labels, though seemingly innocuous, can become incredibly powerful in shaping a child's identity and their role within the family system. Sarah, it seemed, learned early on that her emotional displays, her dramatic retellings of events, often garnered her the attention and sympathy she craved. Emily, on the other hand, learned that her logical, fact-based approach often fell on deaf ears, or worse, was seen as cold and unfeeling. This established a pattern. Sarah would present an emotionally charged narrative, often with significant embellishments, and receive sympathy or concern. Emily would attempt to interject with factual corrections, only to be dismissed as harsh or unsupportive. This wasn't just about truth, it was about the impact of the truth and the emotional resonance each sister sought. Sarah wanted to be believed, not necessarily for the accuracy of her story, but for the feelings it evoked. Emily wanted to be understood, not for her emotional state, but for her objective understanding of events. And these two desires were constantly at odds, creating a chasm between them that only widened with each passing year. It was a classic case of two people speaking different languages, trying desperately to communicate, but only managing to deepen the misunderstanding and resentment. And this wasn't just happening on a superficial level, it was shaping their very identities, their core beliefs about themselves and each other. As they grew into adulthood, these childhood patterns didn't just fade away, they calcified, becoming the deeply grooved pathways of their relationship. What started as subtle bids for attention or differing interpretations of events evolved into full-blown accusations and character assassinations. The stakes became higher. Careers, reputations, marriages, everything became fodder for their ongoing war. Sarah, true to her established pattern, would often recount incidents with a dramatic flair, exaggerating details, or inventing entire conversations that supported her narrative of victimhood. For example, if a mutual friend was having a party and Sarah wasn't invited, she might interpret it as Emily actively campaigning against her, poisoning the well, and then she would relay this story to others with such conviction, such emotional weight, that it became her truth. She genuinely believed Emily was out to get her, that every perceived slight, every social exclusion was orchestrated by her sister. This wasn't just a convenient lie for Sarah. It became a core belief, an unshakable truth that justified her own subsequent actions, which often involved retaliating against Emily in various ways, sometimes quite subtly, sometimes overtly. Emily, on the other hand, found herself constantly in the position of defending against these phantom attacks. Imagine the psychological toll of constantly being accused of things you didn't do, of having your character maligned by your own sister to people you both care about. Emily's response, often driven by a desperate need to clear her name and expose what she saw as Sarah's fabrications, only served to fuel Sarah's narrative. When Emily would present factual counter-arguments, receipts, or direct testimony from others to refute Sarah's claims, Sarah would interpret this as Emily's malicious attempt to discredit her, to gaslight her, to make her out to be crazy. It was a vicious cycle. Emily's attempts at grounding Sarah in reality were seen by Sarah as further evidence of Emily's betrayal and cruelty. Their conflict wasn't just confined to their private interactions. It bled into family gatherings, making holidays and celebrations tense minefields. Parents caught in the middle often found themselves trying to mediate, or worse, inadvertently taking sides, which only deepened the rift. Sarah's tears and emotionally charged appeals often swayed their mother, leading to an environment where Emily felt unheard and unsupported. Their father, perhaps more prone to logic, might try to intervene with facts, only to be met with Sarah's accusations of being cold or not understanding her feelings. Spouses became embroiled, forced to navigate the treacherous waters of their wives' sisterly feud, often finding themselves alienated from the other side of the family. Friends were put in an impossible position, forced to choose loyalties or distance themselves from the drama altogether. This isn't just about two sisters fighting. It's about a relational system in complete dysfunction, with each member playing an unwitting role in perpetuating the chaos. One particular incident that truly escalated things and ultimately led them to our stage involved a significant family inheritance. Their beloved grandmother had passed away, leaving a substantial sum of money and a family home. Sarah, in her version, claimed that Emily had manipulated their grandmother in her final days, influencing the will to her own advantage, cutting Sarah out of a fair share. She accused Emily of being greedy, heartless, and opportunistic. Sarah then began telling anyone who would listen, including extended family members and mutual acquaintances, that Emily had stolen her inheritance, painting a vivid picture of Emily's alleged duplicity. She even started posting cryptic messages on social media, hinting at betrayal within the family, generating a wave of speculation and concern among their social circles. Emily, utterly blindsided and deeply hurt by these accusations, was horrified. The will, as it turned out, divided the assets fairly and legally, with both sisters receiving equal shares, as was confirmed by the estate lawyer. Emily's perspective was that Sarah had simply misunderstood the legal terminology, or perhaps had an inflated sense of what she was owed. But for Sarah, the facts didn't matter. Her feeling of being wronged was her reality. Emily's attempts to present the legal documents, to explain the nuances of estate law, were all interpreted by Sarah as further evidence of Emily's cunning, of her trying to cover her tracks. The emotional impact of Sarah's public accusations devastated Emily, not just because of the damage to her reputation, but because it felt like a complete betrayal of their shared history, their bond, and their grandmother's memory. This particular incident was the breaking point. Emily had endured years of what she perceived as Sarah's delusions and manipulations, but the inheritance issue, with its public accusations and the tarnishing of her character, was a line she felt had been crossed. She wanted Sarah to stop. She wanted Sarah to acknowledge the truth. She wanted Sarah to get help. And Sarah, for her part, felt equally wronged, equally misunderstood. She genuinely believed she had been cheated. And she wanted the world, and most importantly, me, to see Emily for the conniving person she believed her to be. They both came to the show seeking vindication, but what they really needed was a mirror, a way to see past their own defensive narratives and understand the deeper psychological forces at play. They needed a reality check, and that's precisely what I aim to provide. So there we were, Sarah and Emily, sitting across from me, Two women trapped in a generational loop of misunderstanding and emotional warfare. I could feel the tension, thick and palpable, even before they uttered a single word. Sarah, ever the performer, sat with an air of dignified grievance, ready to present her case. Emily, visibly weary, clutched her hands in her lap, her eyes holding a mixture of pain and a desperate plea for someone to finally see her side of the story. My job in that moment wasn't to be a judge, but a truth teller, to cut through the noise and get to the core of what was truly happening. I started by giving Sarah the floor, allowing her to articulate her accusations against Emily. And she did, with fervor and conviction. She recounted the inheritance story, painting Emily as a deceitful, manipulative sister who had preyed on their dying grandmother. She listed other instances stretching back years of perceived slights, betrayals, and Emily's alleged attempts to undermine her. As she spoke, her voice rose and fell with dramatic inflection, her eyes welling up at just the right moments, clearly demonstrating her belief in her own narrative. As I listened, I wasn't just hearing the words, I was watching the performance, the subtle cues, the way she carefully avoided any direct gaze from Emily, the way her story became more embellished with each retelling. And then I turned to Emily. I asked her to respond, to give her version. Emily, speaking more softly, more factually, presented the evidence, the will, the lawyer statements, the clear and undeniable truth that the inheritance was equally divided. She didn't try to demonize Sarah. She simply laid out the facts, her voice tinged with the sadness of someone who had tried repeatedly to reason with an unreasoning force. This is where the direct confrontation began. Sarah, I said, cutting through her next attempt to interrupt Emily, I have the legal documents right here. They clearly state that you and Emily received equal shares of your grandmother's estate. Your lawyer confirms it. Your parents confirmed it. Why do you insist that Emily stole your inheritance? Sarah's composure, which had been so carefully maintained, began to crack. Her eyes darted around. Her usual smooth delivery faltered. But she talked to Grandma constantly. She stammered. She was always whispering things. I felt like she was trying to turn her against me. And the house, Emily got the house, and I didn't. Sarah, I pressed. Emily got the house because she was the only one who wanted it, and she bought out your share at fair market value as stipulated in the will. You received the cash equivalent. Do you remember signing those papers? There was a moment of silence, a beat where the air seemed to thicken. Sarah hesitated, then mumbled, well, yes, but it wasn't fair. It felt like she still got more. This was the opening. This wasn't about facts anymore. It was about feelings, about a deeply ingrained sense of injustice regardless of reality. So what I'm hearing, Sarah, I leaned forward, my voice firm but empathetic, is that even when the facts, the legal documents, and the testimony of multiple people directly contradict your story, you still feel like you're being wronged. You feel like Emily is always trying to get one up on you, even when there's no evidence to support it. Is that accurate? Her shoulders slumped slightly. She always has, she whispered, her voice losing some of its dramatic edge, revealing a younger, more vulnerable self underneath. She was always Mom and Dad's favorite. Always the smart one, the pretty one, the one who did everything right. I always felt like I had to fight for attention, and there it was. The buried resentment, the core wound. This wasn't about the inheritance. It was about a lifetime of perceived competition, a deep-seated insecurity rooted in childhood. I turned to Emily. Emily, do you hear that? Do you understand what Sarah is saying? Emily, tears now streaming down her face, nodded slowly. I knew she felt that way sometimes, she said, her voice choked with emotion. But I never understood why. I always felt like I was the one who had to be strong to take care of things. I never thought about it like that she felt like I was getting more. Sarah, I continued, your perception, your feelings, they're real to you. But what happens when those feelings lead you to create a reality that isn't true? What happens when you tell stories, invent situations, accuse your sister of things she hasn't done based solely on your feelings of being wronged? Do you understand the damage that does? To her reputation, yes, but more importantly, to the very fabric of your relationship, to your family. She looked at Emily, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not the manipulative villain of her constructed narrative, but a hurt, exhausted sister. The carefully erected walls of her denial began to crumble. There was no grand, dramatic confession, no sudden epiphany with bright lights and choirs. It was much more subtle, much more human. It was a slow dawning, a moment where the weight of her own actions, the consequences of her fabricated reality, began to settle upon her. She didn't immediately apologize. That would come later, perhaps, if at all. But in that moment, I saw a flicker of understanding, a chink in the armor of her self-deception. It was the beginning of the breakthrough. Not a complete transformation, but a vital opening. You have two choices here, Sarah, I stated, my voice softening slightly, but still firm. You can continue down this path, living in a reality of your own making, pushing away everyone who tries to show you the truth, or you can begin the incredibly difficult work of confronting these deeper feelings, these insecurities, and start to build a relationship with your sister based on honesty and mutual respect. But that means letting go of the story, letting go of the narrative that has served you so well, but has ultimately cost you so much. The air in the studio felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been collectively acknowledged. The confrontation on stage wasn't a magic wand, and I never claim it to be. What it can be, though, is a catalyst, a moment of undeniable truth, spoken plainly, that can shake someone's carefully constructed world. For Sarah, that moment was less about a grand realization and more about the slow, agonizing process of having her most cherished, most deeply ingrained narratives stripped bare, not by an enemy, but by an impartial third party. It's one thing to hear your sister refute your claims. It's another to hear it from someone who has no vested interest, backed by undeniable facts. In the days and weeks following the taping, the initial reactions were, as expected, complex. Sarah initially retreated. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and probably quite angry that her version of events had been so thoroughly dismantled. This is a common reaction when someone's core defense mechanisms are challenged. They've relied on these narratives for so long, they've become so intertwined with their identity that dislodging them feels like an attack on their very self. She wasn't ready to immediately embrace the truth. She had to process the emotional fallout of that public dismantling first. There were tears, accusations of betrayal against me for not taking her side, and a general feeling of injustice. This is part of the process. You don't just undo decades of ingrained behavior and belief systems in an hour-long segment. Emily, on the other hand, experienced a mix of relief and renewed pain. Relief that her truth had finally been acknowledged, that she wasn't crazy for seeing what she saw. But also pain at seeing her sister so clearly unravel and the realization of how deep Sarah's issues truly ran. It wasn't just about the inheritance or past slights. It was about a fundamental inability for Sarah to differentiate between her feelings and objective reality, to own her part in their dysfunction. Emily still loved her sister, despite everything, and seeing her in that raw, exposed state was difficult. She wanted to reach out, but she also knew that years of her attempts to bring Sarah to reality had only backfired. We offered both sisters resources for individual therapy, emphasizing the importance of processing their feelings and behaviors in a safe, confidential space. For Sarah, the focus was on helping her understand the difference between her emotional experiences and factual events to develop healthier coping mechanisms for insecurity and perceived slights, and to explore the roots of her need to embellish or create narratives. For Emily, therapy was about processing the trauma of being repeatedly gaslit and accused, learning to set firm boundaries, and understanding how to navigate a relationship with a sister who might always struggle with reality. The immediate outcome wasn't a storybook reconciliation. There wasn't a tearful embrace where all was forgiven and forgotten. That's rarely how real life works, especially when deep-seated psychological patterns are involved. However, there was a shift, a crucial, albeit subtle, change in the dynamic. Sarah, through continued post-show conversations with our team and eventually with the therapist we connected her with, began to acknowledge that her memory of certain events might not have been entirely accurate. She didn't fully admit to lying, not outright, but she started using phrases like, "Perhaps I misremembered," or "I might have been overly emotional at the time." This was a significant step for her, a crack in the fortress of her absolute certainty. It was a step away from outright denial and towards a tentative acceptance that her internal reality wasn't always synonymous with external reality. Emily, for her part, stopped engaging in the endless cycle of trying to prove Sarah wrong. She learned that she couldn't force Sarah to see the truth, but she could control her own reactions and boundaries. She communicated to Sarah with guidance that while she loved her, she would no longer tolerate false accusations or public defamation. If Sarah continued down that path, Emily would protect herself even if it meant further distance. This wasn't an ultimatum delivered in anger. It was a clear boundary born out of self-preservation and a desire for a healthier, albeit potentially more distant relationship. What came out of it was not a perfectly mended relationship, but a more honest one. They were still sisters, but the terms of their engagement had fundamentally changed. Sarah was beginning the long, arduous journey of self-reflection and healing, learning to confront her insecurities without resorting to fabrication. Emily was finding her voice, setting her boundaries, and reclaiming her peace of mind. They were communicating, albeit carefully, about shared family events, but the deep, emotional wounds still lingered, requiring time and individual work to heal. It's a testament to the fact that not every conflict ends with a dramatic, happy resolution. Sometimes, the most realistic and profound outcome is simply the beginning of a different path, a cessation of the destructive patterns, and a commitment to individual growth. For Sarah and Emily, the journey was far from over, but the direction had shifted. They stepped off the show with a stark, undeniable truth laid bare, and the choice to either continue the old patterns or bravely embark on the challenging road towards genuine self-awareness and a more authentic connection, even if it meant acknowledging painful truths. And sometimes, in my line of work, that's the most powerful outcome you can hope for. The journey for Sarah and Emily, as I observed it unfold, became a testament to the enduring, yet often painful, complexities of family relationships. What was particularly striking was how deeply ingrained these behaviors become, almost like a second skin. Sarah's tendency to embellish, to create a narrative where she was the perpetual victim, wasn't a conscious, malicious act in her mind. It was a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of her world and garner the attention and validation she felt she lacked. This doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps explain its psychological roots. For Emily, her need to correct, to present the facts, was her own way of seeking justice and clarity, a desperate attempt to bring sanity to a relationship that often felt chaotic and gaslighting. In the weeks and months after the show, our follow-up interactions revealed a nuanced evolution. Sarah, for the first time, began to engage with the idea that her perceptions weren't always factual. This was a monumental shift. She started attending therapy sessions, and while the initial sessions were undoubtedly challenging, she began to explore the underlying insecurities that fueled her need for dramatic storytelling. It was a slow, sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. There were moments of frustration, moments where she would revert to old patterns, but the key difference was that she now had a framework, a professional, to help her identify these patterns and challenge them. She started to understand that her feelings of being wronged, while valid as emotions, didn't automatically translate into objective truth. This was particularly evident in how she began to discuss past family events. Instead of stating them as absolute facts, she would say, "I remember feeling like," or "my impression was that." That shift in language, though subtle, signaled a profound internal change. Emily, too, continued her therapeutic journey. Her focus was on healing from the emotional toll of years of being the strong one and the target of Sarah's accusations. She learned to differentiate between loving her sister and enabling her sister's destructive patterns. She established clearer boundaries, not out of anger, but out of a need for self-preservation. She stopped trying to convince Sarah of reality through endless debate and instead focused on protecting her own peace. This meant that while they still interacted at family gatherings, Emily was more selective about the conversations she engaged in. If Sarah started down a path of embellishment or accusation, Emily would politely but firmly disengage, perhaps saying, "Sarah, we've discussed this, and I'm not going to revisit that right now, or I'm not comfortable talking about that." This created a new dynamic, one where Sarah no longer had an audience for her old patterns of manipulation. One particularly poignant moment in their post-show journey occurred during their mother's birthday. Sarah, instead of presenting a dramatic, self-aggrandizing story about how she'd organized the perfect party, simply brought a thoughtful, handmade gift and spent the evening genuinely engaging with family members. When her mother commented on how lovely the party was, Sarah just smiled and said, "It was a team effort." This might seem trivial, but for Sarah, it was a huge step away from her usual need to be the center of attention, the hero of her own narrative. Emily observed this shift not with immediate trust, but with a cautious sense of hope. She saw that Sarah was trying, genuinely trying, even if it was hard for her. The relationship didn't become perfect, not by any stretch. There were still lingering moments of distrust, still occasional miscommunications, and the deep emotional scars wouldn't simply vanish. But what had fundamentally changed was the operating system of their interactions. The constant cycle of accusation and defense had been interrupted. Sarah was learning to take responsibility for her own feelings and actions rather than projecting them onto Emily. Emily was learning to protect herself and love her sister from a healthier distance without sacrificing her own well-being. This situation, like so many others I've witnessed, reminds me that healing is rarely linear and almost never immediate. It's a messy, complex process that requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to look inward, often at the most uncomfortable truths. For Sarah, the breakthrough wasn't a single event, but a continuous journey of self-discovery prompted by that very public confrontation. For Emily, it was the validation and the permission to prioritize her own mental health. What they gained was not a return to some idealized sisterhood, but a chance to forge a new kind of relationship, one built on more authentic, albeit less intense terms. It was a relationship where, perhaps for the first time, there was the potential for genuine understanding, not based on shared narratives of victimhood or blame, but on a mutual, if sometimes painful, recognition of their individual truths and the complex history that shaped them. They had both been trapped in a dance, and while the music hadn't entirely stopped, the steps were beginning to change, leading them towards a future that held more promise for peace than the one they had left behind. You know, when people come on the show, they often have a very specific expectation, a quick fix, a dramatic apology, a sudden and miraculous transformation. And while those moments can happen, they're often the exception, not the rule. What I've seen over decades is that real change is incremental, it's hard, and it often requires a willingness to sit in discomfort for a very long time. For Sarah and Emily, their journey wasn't about a destination, but about the ongoing process of navigating their complex history with new tools and a changed understanding. In the months that followed, their interactions continued to be a delicate dance. Sarah kept up with her therapy, which was crucial. She began to articulate her own fears, her own feelings of inadequacy that had historically driven her to seek validation through exaggeration and dramatic narratives. She started to understand that her desire for attention, while human, had become a destructive pattern, and that her truth was often a filtered, emotionally charged version of reality designed to protect a very vulnerable part of herself. This was a massive cognitive shift for her. It wasn't about being a liar in a malicious sense, but about a deep-seated defense mechanism that had spiraled out of control. The therapist helped her connect these dots, tracing her patterns back to childhood dynamics and perceived slights that had festered over time. For example, Sarah eventually confided in her therapist and later tentatively shared with Emily that she felt Emily had always been the golden child, the one who received more praise for her achievements and stability. This feeling, rather than being expressed directly, had manifested as resentment and a need to subtly undermine Emily or paint herself as the more sympathetic figure. Acknowledging this underlying envy and insecurity was a monumental step for Sarah. It meant taking responsibility for her own feelings rather than externalizing them as Emily's fault. Emily, observing these changes, began to feel a different kind of empathy for Sarah. It wasn't the kind of empathy that excused the past harm, but it was an understanding of the psychological pain that had driven Sarah's behavior. She realized that Sarah's actions weren't always born of pure malice, but from a place of deep insecurity and a distorted view of their relationship. This allowed Emily to temper her anger with a measure of compassion, which was vital for any hope of continued connection. She maintained her boundaries, reinforcing that she would not engage in destructive arguments, but she also opened a small window for a different kind of interaction. Their communication shifted from high-stakes accusations and defenses to more measured conversations. They were able to discuss mundane family matters without immediate escalation. The contentious topic of their grandmother's inheritance, for instance, slowly became something they could refer to with a shared, if still complex, understanding of the legal facts. Sarah stopped bringing it up as an act of theft and instead, if it came up, would speak of her initial feelings of confusion or misunderstanding. Again, these subtle linguistic shifts reflected deeper internal changes. The idea of mending their relationship in the traditional sense of returning to some idyllic sisterhood became less important than establishing a relationship that was healthy, even if it was less close than it once might have been. They both understood that their bond would forever carry the scars of their past conflicts, but those scars no longer defined every interaction. It became about coexisting, about respecting each other's individual paths, and about acknowledging their shared history without allowing it to perpetually poison their present. The most profound outcome, for me, was not a grand reconciliation, but the cessation of hostilities. The psychological war had largely ended. Sarah was no longer actively trying to sabotage Emily's reputation, and Emily was no longer consumed by the need to constantly defend herself. There was a quiet truce built on individual growth and mutual, if sometimes grudging, respect. They learned that sometimes the best way to move forward in a broken relationship isn't to force it back together, but to allow each person to heal individually and then see what kind of connection can emerge from that new, healthier place. It's a powerful lesson in the nature of truth and forgiveness, not necessarily of the grand, religious kind, but the daily, gritty work of acknowledging reality and choosing peace over perpetual conflict. Sarah and Emily's story is a reminder that personal accountability, however painful, is the bedrock of any genuine resolution. And sometimes the most dramatic breakthrough is simply the quiet decision to stop fighting.